What's up, Reclaimers? Welcome back to week 2 of Reclaim Myself. We're working through the Holistic Recovery Workbook. This workbook has been helping people in the transition outside of treatment centers or before they go to treatment centers or doing the work that we're doing in this work. And today there's some heavy work. There's some heavy questions that are going to be asked. I've mentioned before going through this with somebody. I want to encourage you that in this process, you're going to need help. Again, I want to remind you that this is not to be done alone. Find somebody, find a therapist or a life coach or a group of people that you can put together that can work through this material with you. Today, before I ask these questions and we get into the material, continuing in page 1, we're going to start with exercise 4 in part 3. It's page 31. All right, so I want to continue picking up talking about our behavior, but I want to ask this question. Why do you continue to behave in a way that threatens your well-being, even though you know it does so? And so as we explore this question, I want you to consider this for yourself. And any of the things that I say that contribute to this for myself or for others, simply reflect on it for yourself and ask yourself, why are you behaving in such a way that threatens your well-being, even though you know it does? So let's look at some common actions that we know threaten our well-being, but they're still very popular anyway. Drugs and alcohol are a recession-proof addiction that people are using to make money even when people are broke. I know people who've spent their last money on cigarettes and drugs on a regular basis and live in that place where they're spending the last little bit that they have on drugs and alcohol to feed this insatiable appetite. So smoking, overeating, over-exercising, these are some ways that I know that there are people who behave in ways that threaten themselves. I behaved in a way that threatened myself for years because it was like my default mechanism. I was living in a place of fight or flight and anxiety and worry. And living in fear like that, I responded by escape, creating ways for myself to escape from the reality that was oftentimes felt too scary and too painful to even face. As I learned to face the reality of life, oftentimes I felt like I needed medications or I needed to fall back to my tendencies that threatened me in order to survive. I thought that they were helping me. There were times where living in excess felt as if it was the only way that I knew how to survive. I realize today that that's a defense mechanism, but at one point, it was a survival mechanism. Some of these behaviors that we exhibit in here, we can kind of become friends with because in some way we have them to thank for saving our life. Some of the defensive mechanisms that we've learned have been there because our body and our mind was learning to protect itself after going through trauma and other abuses in ways that learn to create safety by recoiling or creating a false reality or delusions, being prone to addiction, escapism in video games, and escapism in a myriad of different ways. I began to behave in a way that threatened me long before I was aware of the fact that I was even doing so, or before it exhibited itself in addictive behaviors or self-destructive behaviors. I see now that the behaviors that I was exhibiting when I was younger are patterns that continued to follow me for years until I began to address why was I doing these behaviors and why was I afraid to change the way that I acted. So today, ask yourself, why are you afraid to change the way that you're acting? More than likely, like me, it was part of the way that I felt safe and protected. The more that I tried for solutions, it seemed the more I had problems. And I found myself in a place where I looked at myself as the problem. And the more I saw myself as the problem, the more that I became the problem. And rather than addressing myself also as the solution to that problem and the solution to these questions, I became stuck in this loop of, I'm the problem, I'm the problem. And so I was afraid to change the fact that I was comfortable being the problem. So these behaviors of self-destruction, self-medicating, overeating, doing risky behavior began to accompany me and were covering up from the real pain, the loneliness, and the isolation that I was feeling inside. But I became habituated to isolation because those behaviors contributed more to my isolation. It was difficult to break these habits because after I created isolation in my life, it was uncomfortable for me and for those around me to welcome me back in. These behaviors that followed me in patterns of mental health struggles and addictions were rooted in things that I learned to believe about myself and about the world around me when I was far younger than that. And I began to self-medicate, and I began to behave in a way that threatened my well-being. And I was afraid to change that because it was protecting me. And so this old habit of protecting myself was actually destroying me and eroding at my relationships and breaking down my trust in the world and my trust in others. So let's be honest with ourselves. These habits are difficult to break because these habits are difficult to even recognize that they're happening. So be patient with yourself as you ask these questions. These are tough questions that expose some of the habits and addictive personality traits that you may exhibit. This is not me saying, hey, you're an addict, because identifying as an addict is different than identifying as a person who's behaved in a way that threatens himself like an addict. Does this behavior allow you to hold on to past fear or pain or resentment? In some ways, we exhibit these patterns because we continue to live in fear or pain or resentment. This book later covers a lot of these topics in more detail, so I would encourage you to stick with this, as fear, pain, and resentment are ongoing work. This is where it's going to take time, because part of ourself learns to live in crisis or pain. Part of ourself learns to live in fight or flight, or in addictive tendencies, in escapism, as we've been talking about. This is a process of learning how to learn from the pain. And so part of you may feel comfortable in some way. So I want you to ask this final question. Does part of you feel more comfortable as a patient or as a victim or as an addict? There are times and places where medication and medical intervention and medical help are necessary, but we have to ask ourselves if that help is allowing us to be more or less of a victim and a patient, if it's allowing us to heal, and if it's allowing us to become less of an addict, to break these tendencies and these patterns that threaten us. And so that's what I want to encourage you with today, is to ask these questions of yourself again, to write your answers down, to look at this space provided on page 31, and to really ask yourself if this way that you're threatening yourself, if becoming aware of it may show you some things of how this started, where this came from, and how you can have the courage. This next chapter we get into, chapter 2, after we're through chapter 1, is about courage. And there's 2 chapters on courage, because finding the courage in you to be able to overcome these tendencies, to address these tendencies and these habits, even as they're difficult to break, it takes courage. And I encourage you to have the courage to continue to show up for yourself, to ask these questions the way that you're doing, by showing up right here, by being here for yourself. I encourage you to talk about these questions with somebody who can hold a safe space with you and can encourage you to find ways to heal from these patterns and to break these patterns and to act and to behave in a different way. I hope that as we practice some very simple steps to address these questions, that you can apply some new answers to the old patterns and the old problems that have been persisting. Thank you for showing up again for you to do this work and to be here for yourself. I hope that you continue to do everything that you can do to reclaim the best of yourself.